Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 lecture videos. Our this week's topic is interest rate risk. We are covering two chapters today, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5 explains the repricing model and chapter 6 illustrates the duration model. And both of these models are to measure interest rate risk exposure of the financial institutions. So first of all, chapter 5, and we have few learning objectives from this chapter. First of all, we will discuss how Reserve Bank of Australia, the Australian Central Bank, can influence interest rates in the market. We will discuss how modern financial institutions typically mismatch the maturities of their assets and liabilities and thereby expose themselves to interest rate risk exposure. We will discuss repricing model, a technique to find out financial institutions' interest rate risk exposure, and we will finally discuss some weaknesses of the repricing model. So I will be dividing the entire chapter into 3 separate videos, and we'll be discussing these 3 different learning objectives. So first of all, the first topic, the level and movement of interest rates. The Central Bank of Australia, that means the RBA's role in the level and movement of interest rate risk exposure is prominent. You know, many factors influence the level and movement of interest rates. However, it is central bank's monetary policy strategy that most directly affect the level and movement of interest rates, and that ultimately affect financial institutions' cost of funds as well as return on assets. For example, if the central bank smooths or targets the level of interest rate, in that case, unexpected interest rate shocks and interest rate volatility tend to be small. The risk exposure of financial institutions from mismatching the maturities of assets and liabilities in that case also tend to be small. On the other hand, to the extent that the central bank targets the supply of bank reserves and is willing to let interest rate find their own levels, that means if central banks let the market to determine the interest rate, then the volatility of interest rate can be high, and the risk exposure of financial institutions to mismatching interest rates, to mismatching maturities of assets and liabilities, and thus interest rate risk exposure will also be high. In 2001, the governor of Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, raised 2 important questions. Why does the Reserve Bank have to change interest rate at all? Why can't the interest rate can't be left constant? Why does the Reserve Bank have to be involved in the first place? Why can't the determination of interest rate may be left to the market? So these issues underlie the question is why there is a need for mechanism other than the market to influence interest rates, and why interest rate change cannot be left solely to the market. Well, the RBA has the model of medium-term inflation targeting as the framework for monetary policy in Australia, and seeks to achieve a rate of increase in the consumer price index between 2 to 3% on an average over time. The impacts on inflation is mainly domestic, but at the same time, the RBA gives a close watch on the global economy and global financial markets, as global developments could outweigh domestic influences. So altogether, RBA actually targeted cash rate to maintain the stability in the financial market. If you look at this figure 5.1 in this slide, you can see the movements of CPI and the reserve cash rate from 1990 to 2013. And you can see that while any time the CPI may be above or below the target cash rate or the target cash range, the average since the 2001 and usually within the RBS range that I just mentioned a few moments back. From the figure, we also see a general correlation between the inflation rate and the RBS cash rate, because you can see that when the CPI tends to decline, the cash rate tends to decline, and when CPI tends to increase, the cash rate also tends to increase. I will come back to this point again. The RBS management of monetary policy is not confined to the announcement of target cash rate that we just discussed in the previous slide, but it occurs daily through its open market operations, where it buy and sell treasury bonds, treasury notes, and sometimes other securities in the secondary market. Okay, in your basic economics course, you know that a central bank sells the government securities to the market to control money supply, and that ultimately to affect interest rates. For example, when central bank wants to restrict money supply, they sell government bonds to the market and they take the money back from the market. On the other hand, when central bank wants to insert more money in the economy, they buy back the previously sold government securities, so thereby they circulate more money in the economy through these operations. So through these open market operations, central bank influences money supply, inflation, and level of interest rates until the target cash rate is reached. Changes in interest rate will then ultimately affect economic decisions by both businesses and consumers. Business investment and consumer investing or spending will stimulate economic activity, whereas a decline in spending or business investment may slow down the economy. If RBI believes that it needs to stimulate the economy, it may implement an expansionary monetary policy by lowering the interest rate, thereby promoting business investment and consumer spending. Conversely, if there is a need to slow down the economy or contract the economy, RBI would tighten monetary policy through higher interest rates. The RBI's role in assisting to counter some of the market shocks caused by the GFC from 2007 to 2009 is an interesting case study. If you look at the graph in the slide, you can see that yields of 10-year treasury bonds of the Australian government from 1985 to 2013. The first observation is you can see that the degree of volatility appears to be high during the late 1980s. You can see this here through the mid 1990s. And it also interesting to note that the market volatility during the GFC from 2007 to 2009 was far less than the market volatility during the late 1980s and late 1990s. The second observation is that the relative degree of volatility or interest rate uncertainty appears to be linked to RBI's monetary policy strategy. For example, until the early 1970s, the RBA focused on interest rate controls, undertaking activities to target interest rate goals. These approaches abandoned in the mid-1970s when the central bank moved towards monetary targets or conditional projections of money supply growth. This increase of volatility in interest rate over the ensuing period that we have discussed already was actually the result of these monetary policy activities or monetary policy decisions. With the deregulation during the 1980s, there was a move back to the interest smoothing from 1985. However, the effects of these are difficult to see from the figure until the late 1980s due to the impact of both the 1987 stock market crash and the property crash of 1988 and 1989. With the interest targeting, we see far less volatility of interest during the 1997 stock market crash and also the Asian financial crisis and the 2002 terrorist attack in Bali and the GFC period from 2007 to 2009. Regardless of the reasons, interest volatility exists and creates uncertainty in earnings and capital values for all financial institutions. That's why it's important that financial institutions effectively measure their interest rate risk exposure and take decisions and take positions to manage this risk accordingly. In the next video, we will learn the repricing model that financial institutions use to measure their interest rate risk exposure. Thank you very much.